Roosevelt, Astor, Forbes, Yale, Harvard. You know these names. What you don't know, they all got rich the exact same way. Flooding China with opium, thousands of tons, millions addicted, 400% profit, and then they spent 200 years making sure you'd never find out. Some of America's elite families built their fortunes on a dark secret, the opium trade. And yes, that includes one of the most famous names in American history. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States, came from a family that made its wealth by selling opium in China. It's not something you'll find in most history books, but the Roosevelt fortune was tied to the very drug that fueled addiction and conflict across Asia. While FDR would later lead the nation through some of its toughest times, his family's past was built on a trade that left devastation in its wake. It's a stark reminder that even the most revered legacies have shadows lurking beneath the surface. The Astors were a name that carried weight, the kind of weight that came with gilded ballrooms and whispered deals in dimly lit parlors. They didn't just have money, they had the kind of fortune that could bend cities to their will, the kind that made presidents take their calls. And it all started with a single bitter seed, opium. Back in the 1800s, when the world was still raw and hungry, the Astors saw an opportunity. They didn't just trade in the stuff, they built an empire on it, shipping crates of the drug across oceans, turning pain into profit. The money poured in, thick and fast, and with it came land, power, influence. By the time the world decided opium was a sin, the Astors were already saints in the Church of American Wealth, their name carved into marble and gold. Now, generations later, the family still sat at the top, their hands clean, their history polished. But the truth? The truth was that every dollar in their vaults had once been stained the color of poppy fields. You know, there's this little-known fact about Forbes magazine that doesn't get talked about much. Back in the day, the Forbes family made their fortune in the opium trade. Yeah, you heard that right. The same magazine that now ranks billionaires and talks about business success. It was built on profits from selling opium. The family patriarch, John Murray Forbes, was a key player in the 19th century opium trade between the US and China. The wealth from that trade helped lay the foundation for what would eventually become the media empire we know today. So when you see that Forbes logo, it's not just about business. It's a legacy tied to one of history's most controversial industries. Kind of makes you look at those richest people lists a little differently, doesn't it? So let's talk about Yale's Skull and Bones Society. You know, that secretive group that's been whispering in the halls of power for centuries. Now, here's a twist you might not have heard. Some folks say the whole thing got its start with a pretty shady cash flow. We're talking opium smugglers, back in the day, when fortunes were made on the high seas, and not all of them were exactly legal. Picture this: the early 1800s, trade routes buzzing, and a certain family, the Russells, allegedly making bank off the opium trade. William Huntington Russell, one of the founders of Skull and Bones, came from a family that was deep in the game. Now, I'm not saying they were counting drug money in the tomb, but let's just say the timing and the connections raise a few eyebrows. The society was founded in 1832, right when the opium trade was booming, and suddenly these guys had the funds to build their mysterious little clubhouse, the Tomb, and keep it running for generations. Of course, Yale's not exactly advertising this part of the story, but when you dig into the history, it's hard to ignore the whispers. Money talks, and back then, it might have been talking in a language that wasn't exactly above board. So next time you hear about Skull and Bones and all its powerful alumni, maybe ask yourself, where did all that influence really come from? So here's the thing about Harvard's old buildings. They weren't just built with bricks and mortar. A lot of that money came from a pretty dark place. Back in the 1800s, Harvard was growing fast, and they needed cash to put up all those grand halls and libraries. Where'd they get it? Well, a big chunk came from the opium trade with China. See, American merchants, some of them Harvard alumni, were making fortunes selling opium to the Chinese. The British were doing it too, but these Yankee traders were right in the thick of it. They'd ship opium from India into China, despite it being illegal, and rake in the silver. That silver then flowed back to the States, and some of it ended up in Harvard's coffers. It wasn't just some shady backroom deal either. Respectable families, the kind who had their names on buildings, were tied to this trade. They'd donate big sums. And Harvard, well, they weren't about to ask too many questions. So when you walk through those historic gates, remember, some of that ivy was watered with opium silver. By the time the 1830s rolled around, American families weren't just dipping their toes into the opium trade, they were knee-deep. Picture this: a full tenth of all the opium flooding into China was being shipped, sold, and profited from by American merchants. That's right, 1 in 10 of those little chests of opium stamped with foreign marks had ties back to the States. Families with names that sounded as proper as any New England church had built fortunes on the backs of this trade. They weren't just bystanders, they were players, Big ones, moving product across oceans like it was just another commodity. And in a way, it was. The demand was there, the money was good, and the moral questions? Well, those got lost somewhere in the Pacific winds. It wasn't just a side hustle. It was a full-blown industry, and America was right in the thick of it. Warren Delano II was a man of ambition and cunning, a man who saw opportunity where others saw only risk. In the early 1800s, he carved out a fortune by smuggling opium into China, a trade that was as lucrative as it was controversial. The British had already made their mark in the Opium Wars, and Delano wasn't about to let such a profitable venture slip through his fingers. He worked the shadows, navigating the dangerous waters of international trade with a ruthless efficiency. The profits from his ventures were staggering, enough to build a 40-room mansion in Newburgh, New York, a grand estate that stood as a testament to his wealth and influence. It was a place of opulence, a far cry from the murky dealings that had funded its construction. Delano's name became synonymous with both power and infamy, a man who had played the game of global commerce and won, no matter the cost. His legacy was built on the backs of a trade that would leave scars across nations, but in the halls of his mansion, none of that seemed to matter. John Jacob Astor wasn't just rich. He was the richest man in America, a title that carried weight and whispers alike. His fortune didn't come from railroads or steel or any of the usual suspects of the time. No. His empire was built on something far more controversial: opium. That's right, the very drug that fueled both medicine and misery across the globe. Astor saw an opportunity in the 19th century when the demand for opium was skyrocketing, and he didn't hesitate. He traded it, shipped it, and turned it into a fortune so vast it made kings envious. Some called him a visionary, others a villain. But no one could deny the sheer scale of his wealth or the shadow it cast over his legacy. The Forbes family of Boston wasn't just another wealthy clan in the early 1800s. They were key players in a dark and lucrative trade. While their name might bring to mind old money and high society, their fortune was built on something far more sinister: opium. Shipping the drug from Turkey to China, they were part of a network that fueled addiction and exploitation, all while lining their pockets. It wasn't just business for them, it was empire building, and they did it with the same ruthless efficiency as any merchant of the time. The opium trade was brutal, but for the Forbes family, it was just another way to secure their place among America's elite. Their story isn't just about wealth, it's about how far some would go to get it. The opium trade didn't just leave scars, it tore through the heart of China. By the time the dust settled, the economy was in ruins, families were shattered, and millions were trapped in the grip of addiction. What started as a trickle of trade became a flood of suffering, draining wealth and hope alike. The streets that once buzzed with commerce now echoed with the hollow cries of those lost to the drug. It wasn't just a market collapse, it was a slow, creeping devastation that reshaped a nation. And the worst part? The damage didn't end when the trade did. The addiction lingered, a shadow that stretched across generations, a wound that refused to heal. China would carry the weight of those years long after the last opium pipe was broken.